Well, welcome to our almost last community Zoom call for this fall. We're going to be doing one more in October and one in November. And in between, there will be the Wings for Widows benefit, which is on October 8th. And I want you to mark your calendars if you haven't done that already. You should be receiving emails that tell you how to watch it. It's on Facebook. And it starts at 7 o'clock, and you just go on to Facebook. There's a Wings for Widows page that you'll follow, and it'll be a live event you'll be able to watch. You'll hear a lot about what we've been doing, a lot from our clients. We have several clients that will be coming on the call to talk about their experience with Wings for Widows. And we have good entertainment. And the carrot at the end of the stick is a trip to Hawaii. So I hope you will listen to our benefit on It's Thursday, October 8th at 7 p.m. So if you don't have that on your calendar, be sure and put it on your calendar. We are also very privileged to have Jenny Schroedel with us tonight. Jenny is the chaplain with Optage Hospice, which works with Presbyterian homes and services. And she is their grief support and education chaplain across all their sites. She will also be teaching a class for us for Wings for Widows that starts a week, can you believe it? A week from tomorrow, October 1st. And that class will explore, it's called Grief Explorations, and she's going to take time to explore how grief affects our mind, body, and spirit, and give us a lot of good tips on how to endure the grief that we are all experiencing. She's also an author. Her most recent is called Naming the Child, Hope-Filled Reflections on Stillbirth, Miscarriage, and Infant Death. Jenny has recently moved back to the Twin Cities from Hawaii, where she lived, I believe, for 10 years. Is that
10
right,
years,
Jenny?
Yep.
And why did she come back here? Because for such a time as this. She was a chaplain there with bereavement services in Kona, and helped found Hospice of Kona. I'm not going to say this right. Maluihi.
Maluihi. I know so many vowels in Hawaiian. I know. Grief Center.
It was a grief center. Anyway, sorry about butchering the Hawaiian name, but she has tremendous experience, and I know she'll be very helpful to us this evening. After Jenny finishes talking, we have questions. Grant Meyer, one of our Wings for Widows coaches, will be coming on to talk about refinancing your house. So with that, I want to introduce Jenny and give her the screen. Please keep your device on mute. And if you do have questions for Jenny, she's happy to take them. Please type them using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. That will be a big help to us to keep things clear so everyone can hear everything. Thank you. And again, thanks, Jenny, for coming on with us tonight.
Of course, I'm glad to be here. So can you all, Leanne, can you see my screen already? You can see the PowerPoint, right? All right, so this is really a 6-month kind of check-in. When this pandemic began, I think many of us thought, well, we'll give it a couple months and things will come back to normal or something, but actually it's been 6 months. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the special experience you may be having experienced the death of a spouse and being in the midst of this pandemic. all of the levels of complexity and also offer some concrete tools for survival as we head into the coming winter. I know there's widespread dread and fear about the winter coming, and so I thought maybe we could shine a light into it a little bit and talk about how we might get through. But first, I'm going to just kind of walk us back a little. So the image I chose is multiple leaves because we're in fall, obviously, but we are in the strangest fall ever, probably. I don't know if any of you can recall a fall quite as complex as this. So for those of you that have tuned in for this call, I know that number one is the loss of a spouse and how that colors everything. But in the atmosphere around us, and maybe some of us have also experienced the death of a loved one to COVID, in the atmosphere around us, we are seeing widespread loss of life. Nearly 200,000 was the last number I heard, plus 1 million people across the world. These numbers are almost impossible to fully take in. And I think it's worth just kind of pausing to realize how huge this is. There's also been this loss of structure, the structure of our lives, what we were accustomed to, and even our rituals. And if any of you experienced the death of a spouse during the pandemic, you might have had a really different memorial, or maybe you're waiting to have the memorial. These sacred rituals that mark the end of a life, we can't do in the same way. Even our Sunday services that we might like to attend, maybe we haven't been able to go physically, that's been changed. Graduations, if any of you had either college grads or high school grads, so much was lost there. And then obviously the widespread economic distress. And I think of this pandemic like an earthquake with multiple aftershocks. Now, I lived in Hawaii for 10 years. I actually left because of the Kilauea volcanic eruption. And during that time, we had 100 days of volcanic activity, and we had hundreds of earthquakes every day. I don't think that's entirely unlike this pandemic. We're just kind of being hit again and again by something new. Along with that, obviously, the social unrest, all of the issues that came up around George Floyd's death, and what people experienced in this city and across the country that is still very much unsettled and unanswered. Nora Zeal Hurston said, there are years that ask questions and there are years that answer. 2020 is certainly a year that asks questions. Now, I think this is a really helpful chart, and you can look at this for any crisis that you've been through in your life. The United States government developed this looking at how people responded to the crises that have come to us over the last almost 20 years. It was 19 years ago. September 11th was probably the first one that they were looking at. But this is a common pattern, and you can probably see it in your own experience of the pandemic, perhaps even in your experience with the death of your spouse, where there's a warning. We experienced that fear back in January when we saw what was happening in Wuhan, wondering. I think the moment of threat with this pandemic was when it came to Kirkland, Washington, and hit that life care center. And then the impact, I think each of us might know that moment of impact. And then there's often a rush of adrenaline. I think this can be similar to personal grief as well, a time where the community comes together. And then I just want to highlight the next thing is the great slide, the disillusionment. And many of us may be there right now. But as you look at this, I think it's just really important to ask yourself, where am I on this graph now? And what might I do to find my way forward? Oftentimes there's a certain situation in our life that's the most difficult, and it's worthwhile to try to identify that. Now, I mentioned before that this pandemic brings almost every kind of grief with it. And I don't want to take too much time because I think you're all in this world of grief right now. But I've never, as a grief specialist, I've never seen something that hit on almost every type of grief I can think of. Anticipatory, where you're waiting for something to happen, not knowing what it'll be like. Ambiguous, where it's kind of unclear exactly what it is. Other people may not understand it, and it may be marked by a kind of chronic sadness, where you go to bed sad, you wake up sad. Clear grief, that's the kind of grief most of us think about when we think about grief, where somebody has died. And then complicated. And some of you may have experienced complicated grief, especially if you've had a loved one with COVID. Complicated grief is a grief where there's something about the death that's hard to work out. There may be regrets that come up. There may be things you wish you'd said or things you wish you'd done. Something that I work with quite a lot as a grief counselor. Grief, many of you have been experiencing probably like an earthquake, these aftershocks. But I just want to call some of these out because most people don't realize that this could be grief. Number one, irritability. If you are more irritable than normal, that could very well be grief. Both the combination of the death of a spouse and then this whole atmosphere of grief that we're in. Apathy, where maybe you don't really feel that excitement about doing things, and then difficulty focusing or remembering things. Some of us need more time to ourselves. Some of us need more time with others in the midst of grief. And then insomnia has been a really big pattern that electric companies across the country have actually been able to see that the widespread pattern since this pandemic has hit us is that many of us are up late into the night. Perhaps we've been Googling, trying to understand what's happening, and then sleeping in the morning. Insomnia is widespread. Some of us might be just exhausted. And the two here that I think are really important just to note that you may need professional help would be substance abuse. And in many cases, people are reaching for maybe a little bit more alcohol just to dull the pain. I know that alcohol, that's one of the businesses that's done excellently well through this pandemic. All the wine shops they are thriving, and that's in part because people might want to dull the pain. But if that's an issue for you, that's one to get help for. Also, increased risk of anxiety or depression. That would be another one to reach out for help. And then there's also traumatic loss. And people often confuse grief and trauma, and they might say that a grief experience is a traumatic experience. And I want to separate the two because I think over the last 6 months, some of us might have experienced either one or the other or both. The most important difference between grief and trauma is that trauma is primarily experienced as terror. So if you can think about an experience in your life where there was a loss that went with it and terror was what you remember, that was likely trauma. Normal grief, the primary experience is sadness. Grief is obviously often expected, not always. Trauma kind of comes out of the blue. You know, the situation that we had in Minneapolis, I live in South Minneapolis, so night after night of fires and rioting and helicopters, that would be more in the trauma category. It was unexpected. Nobody knew when it was going to stop or how to be safe. Also, it's really important to know that in grief, it often helps to talk, and many of you may have experienced that. And in trauma, it may not help. So it's not really good to push people that have been through something traumatic to talk about it. Because in trauma, when you talk about it, you may actually relive the experience. You experience it each time you tell the story. And we don't want people to have to experience that distress over and over. With normal grief, we're going to remember things. We might experience some of the emotions connected with an experience, but we're not reliving it inside of our bodies. So this would be another thing if you've experienced some trauma that you may want to get professional help with that. One of the things about trauma that is very interesting to me is that even though some people may need professional help, studies are showing now that 65% of people who go through something traumatic actually do not experience PTSD, may not need professional help. You only really know you need it if your function is impacted, and it takes a while to really know. It's going to be normal to be shaken by trauma. So that I just wanted to kind of tease those things apart because that could be part of the experience for each of you. Now, after traumatic experiences, but also applicable for grief, it's really helpful to just care for your body. So if any of you are feeling like this has been traumatic these last 6 months or particular experiences, think about things you could do for your body. Yoga, getting a massage, gentle exercise, no need to run a marathon, just things that are gentle. Also, reducing stimulation. Many of us have just had too much coming at us for too long. And I have this quote by Hillison. She was actually killed at a concentration camp in the Holocaust, but she has a beautiful, beautiful book about going through difficulty and how she's survived. The book is called Eddie. But she wrote, "In the past, I had to keep withdrawing from the world because it's many," I'm sorry, I can't see my own quote because of where the picture is. "It's many impressions." Sorry, let me get back. There, I'm back. Let me move. "Because its many impressions confused me and made me unhappy. I would have to escape into a quiet room. But now I carry this quiet room inside me and can escape to it at any moment." I think this is a really important skill in both grief or trauma, to withdraw into a for real quiet room, especially in this time where we're so overloaded with all that's happening in the world, but also build a quiet room inside of yourself. So to get through this, the question at the beginning, where do we go from here? Obviously, none of us know exactly where we're going from here. I can't make any predictions. Obviously, we're in a time of great uncertainty, but I can offer 3 concrete things that might help us, especially now we're in fall, we're headed into winter. So 3 things that might help us. Self-care. Self-care is number 1. So with self-care, simply to pace yourself as we head into this winter season, knowing that we've already been in something like a marathon. It's been months and months of challenge. Also, like I mentioned with the quiet room, limiting media exposure. I was with my mom at the doctor, and her doctor told her, this was actually a cardiologist, the cardiologist said, no more than 30 minutes of consuming the news. I think that's a pretty good guideline. We could literally watch the news from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed, and all it's going to do is overwhelm us further. Also, to get as much rest as we can, and to engage in simple rituals, whatever they might be, just to know that you have something you can count on. One of my family's simple, silly rituals is we now order donuts every Saturday morning. We just know it's something that's going to happen on Saturday and set that day apart. So think about something that could be predictable. And as winter is coming, just to make a plan. This is a picture from my front porch. That's the logs stacked out there. That's part of our plan, is build some fires, read some books, whatever feels right to you, but just try to put something into your winter that you can anticipate. Number 2 is purpose. So self-care and purpose. When you are grieving, often you won't be able to clearly see purpose, especially in early grief. You might not know your purpose right away, especially if you were a caregiver for a long time for your spouse, or if your identity was really in that relationship. It might be really hard to see your purpose. But even just to ask that question, what might my purpose be, can help you toward this. Rainer Maria Rilke said, I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. So reaching out, noticing people beyond our home, beyond our own little situation, but also sometimes when we reach out, if we start to feel overwhelmed, reaching back in. And I think in this time especially, we might have to do some outreach, in-reach, outreach, because there's just so much happening around us. And then finally, the last thing I want to leave with you is hope. So I participated in a webinar a couple years ago. It was very interesting. It said that the two things most helpful for a brain that is grieving are a thought of hope and a thought of the future. Now, the future, that was back then, 2 years ago. I can't really, you may have a hopeful thought about the future. For example, if you win the Hawaii trip, the Wings for Widows event, you can hope for that, have that idea of the future. You might also just want to make some plans for this winter, making them in pencil. Perhaps I'm going to go to the North Shore, or something you can look forward to, even if you know that that could change, because all plans are subject to change. But hope can make a real change inside of your brain. In grief, it's often really hard to have a thought of hope. So just 3 qualities of hope. Hope is often realistic, so it's not about being positive. We don't have to be positive and pretend things are happening any differently than they are. We can be with reality and then see what is still possible. Hope is also flexible in the sense that oftentimes we're going to hope for something. We might want it with our whole heart, and we might realize that thing is not going to happen in the way we wanted. And hope can actually travel to a different goal. In my work as a hospice chaplain, many times I've been with families who they were hoping for a cure to the cancer. Once they knew that wasn't going to happen, the hope could shift toward hoping to make some beautiful memories with their loved ones, or hoping to complete a project or meet a goal. Hope is always shifting, and we just have to have eyes to see it. Hope is also one of the most powerful forces in the world, and every good thing you see in this world begins with hope. Every good action, all of these people that are working on vaccines right now, it's got to be hope that gets them out of bed in the morning, right? Hope that we can actually turn the tide and get back to some kind of normalcy in our society. This is a quote from one of my mentors. He died during this pandemic. And he used to say, always act in the name of hope. And that's just a question to sit with. What might hope ask of me now? And finally, I just want to leave you with an image. This is Kinsugi. This is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. And I had really hoped to do this at the Grief Explorations group. I don't think we can do it remotely, but maybe we'll figure out how. This is from Hospice of Kona, where I used to work. And we did this as part of a grief group. The Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The idea is that in life, we can be broken. Many of us will be broken many times. Many of you may have been broken throughout this pandemic, felt, this crack come here, this crack come there. But the idea is that we can both be broken and we can mend, and we don't have to hide the cracks. In Japanese Kinsugi, the gold simply accentuates every place where there's a crack. The cracks become an essential part of our history, and we do become stronger in the broken places. So that's what I've got, and I'll turn it back to you. I'll stop my share here. Leanne, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. I just was fiddling around to try to get back. I wanted to ask if anyone has questions for Jenny. That was wonderful. So many good applications. If anyone has a question for Jenny right now, you certainly can, or if you would rather, you can send a question to me, and that's just Leanne at Wings for Widows. Someone is asking, how is the Japanese gold treatment spelled?
Okay, I'm gonna try to do it here. Kintsugi, Kinsugi. And so you could put that into Google, and if we're ever able to do it with Wings for Widows, I would love to do a Kintsugi workshop like I used to do back in Hawaii. It's a very powerful exercise to go through. We would actually break the bowls together, think about a moment we've been broken, and then help each other to reassemble the bowls.
I think it's beautiful. I've looked to see if I could afford to buy a piece of Kinsugi. No, it's really expensive. The real, Japanese art form.
Because they use actual gold leaf in it.
Yes.
We use gold markers at Hospice of Kona.
Smart idea. Is there anybody that has a question? All right, I just want to again recommend Jenny's class. Again, you can go on the Wings for Widows website to sign up for that class. There will be materials mailed out to you. I believe we've mailed one mailing, but it's not too late to join the class. And it does start on October 1st, and it'll be on Thursday nights for 6 weeks, starting October 1st, skipping October 8th because that's our benefit, but then going into the middle of November. So it's a perfect timing because the last class is on preparing for the holidays. So if you are considering and you haven't done any kind of a grief class before, I would highly recommend Jenny's class. The other 2 classes we're offering right now are on consumer protection, how to protect yourself, your identity, and your information, all of those things. And that's being offered on Monday evenings. And then the other class is on home maintenance. And for many of us widows, that is a new field of endeavor that we have never had to tackle before. I remember the first time Chris Bentley came to visit me at my house, the faucet, it was in the winter, and the faucet had been dripping outside for probably weeks, maybe months, I don't know, but there was a big ice pile underneath that faucet. And he said, do you know you're supposed to shut that off from the inside? I had no idea. That was something Dave did. So if that's something that you could benefit from, be sure and check that out. You'll be able to enroll in that class as well. All those classes start in October. I am going to introduce our second speaker. It's Grant Meyer. Grant is one of our coaches for Wings for Widows. He's a fairly new coach on our volunteer staff, and he has been a certified financial planner for over 12 years now. He actually grew up in Coon Rapids and went to Totino Grace, and then went to Concordia University, and has since then been in practice with, let me see, I'm gonna miss it here, the Financial Planning Association. He's been the Public Relations Committee Chair. So I wanted to introduce Grant. He has 2 little girls, 2 and 4 years old, and a wonderful extended family here in the Twin Cities area. And we really want to welcome you tonight, Grant. Thank you so much. I haven't actually met him ever before, so this is
Just,
my
I
first
think we were
time
on
meeting Grant.
one Zoom together, maybe. Yeah,
So, yeah, just for a few minutes, but
just
I
for a
haven't
minute.
really ever talked to you or gotten to know you very well. So this is a great experience for me as well. I'm actually refinancing my house on Monday, Grant.
Well,
So
that's fantastic.
I
Yeah,
guess I
there'll be some good
answered the
information.
question. Maybe it took since May. That's how busy the place was.
Yes,
Anyway, I will let Grant get started, and be sure and ask questions using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
perfect. Thank you so much, Leanne, for that introduction. Jenny, it was fantastic as well. Thank you so much for that. And tonight at 7:30, we get to learn a little bit about mortgages. And the hope is that after this presentation, you won't necessarily be a mortgage expert, but you'll just maybe take away a few tips and tricks to be a little bit more aware of what's going on, if you should refinance, why are we even talking about this right now. And everybody should see a presentation on my screen. If not, just let me know and I'll pull up the chat window there. There we go. So I'll watch the chat window too, just to check for any questions. So who is this presentation for? Anyone with a mortgage currently is a little bit obvious, but also even if you don't have one right now, you may have a really good friend or a family member and they may not be aware of this opportunity that they could have right now. So it's a good presentation, I think, for most people. And what we'll discuss on this call is considerations for refinancing, some common types of refinancing, because there's actually a few different types out there. Should you do a 15-year versus a 30-year mortgage, and some considerations for that. What the infamous break-even point is when you do a refinance, and then a few other kind of tips and tricks. And by the way, one thing that Leanne was alluding to when she gave my introduction, I've been a financial planner now for 12 years, and part of my job that I do full-time is not only helping with investments, but also helping with basically anything that involves money. So I'm often involved in clients' refinancing situations. So I have a few good considerations that you might not have heard before. So why even talk about refinancing right now? Big thing is rates are at historic lows. If anybody's been a homeowner for a while, you may remember the 80s when interest rates were in the teens, and interest rates now have dropped well below 3%. And as a result, with a lower interest rate on a mortgage, it gives you the opportunity to save money. So should you refinance? Should you consider that? It's going to depend upon a few different factors. First is going to be how big your mortgage is. And why does that matter? Well, when you do a refinance, there's some fixed costs that exist, no matter if you have a $400,000 mortgage or a $100,000 mortgage. The size of your mortgage and how far into it you are will impact whether or not refinancing is a good option for you. As a general rule of thumb, because there are some fixed costs doing a refinance, the smaller your mortgage gets, especially if it's under $100,000, refinancing can start to maybe not make sense for you, even though you get a lower interest rate, because you still have to overcome so much costs, and those costs are going to be a very large portion of your loan. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I bring up what a break-even point is. The other thing is you want to take a look at where your current interest rate is versus what your new rate could be. If your rate is above 4% right now, I would say this is a very serious consideration for you to look into refinancing. If you've refinanced recently, perhaps at the beginning of this year, you may or may not make sense for you to refi. And the next big thing is how long you're going to be in your home. So when you do a refinance, and we'll get into this here in a couple of slides, there are a few different types. One in which you pay some costs to get the new mortgage and get that lower rate, and then other types of loans where you maybe don't have costs. And if you're going to pay money to do a refinance, it may make sense only if you're going to be in your home for the foreseeable future, at least maybe for the next 3 to 5 years where you can get past the break-even point. If you're going to be moving pretty quickly, perhaps even within the next 6 months or so, going through a refinance process just might not make sense for you. So generally, again, if your mortgage is roughly above 100 some thousand, and then it also, if you have a larger home, there is something called a jumbo mortgage, but for now, we'll just assume you have a normal size mortgage below 500,000, above 100,000. If your rate's above 4%, you should very seriously look at this, and also assuming you're going to be in your home for a little while. So I mentioned that there's a few different types of refinances out there. And the most common one, which people are familiar with, would be the traditional refinance, where you pay some costs to get your rate lowered and get a new mortgage. And those closing costs vary by institution. You're going to want to shop around to make sure you're getting a fair cost. And I'll talk about that, how that impacts your credit here in a little bit. The second type is a no-cost loan. And in order to do a no-cost loan, there's no free lunch here. So what happens is with a traditional cost loan, what you'll see is you'll get a lower interest rate. With a no-cost loan, they give you a higher interest rate, but you don't have any money out of your own pocket. A traditional cost mortgage is generally good for people who are going to stay in their home for a long time because they have a better opportunity at making up those closing costs they're going to be paying. If you perhaps won't be in your home, maybe for only a year or two, a no-cost mortgage, no-cost refi could be a really good option for you, because what happens is you don't have any money out of pocket and your rate can be instantly lowered. So there's no break-even point that you necessarily need to be concerned about. So a no-cost loan could be a good option for people who maybe don't have some money out of pocket, don't want to raise their mortgage balance, or maybe moving in the near term. I'd say 1 to 2 years is a good rule of thumb. Lastly, there is such thing as a cash out refinance. And what a cash out refi is essentially you go to the mortgage company, you get a new mortgage, but your mortgage may be small and your home value could be large. And so you have what's known as equity in there. And a cash out refi allows you to take out some of that equity and use that for whatever reason. A cash out could be a potentially a good deal if you want to consolidate some debt, take some high interest rate, say credit card debt, and move it to a lower interest rate mortgage. So that'd be a good use. Maybe you have some major home repairs that you need to get done, some maintenance. And generally the big kind of issue where we ran into trouble pre-2008 in the housing crisis is this cash out refi was pretty popular and people were using it incorrectly, pulling money out and then spending it on cars or TVs, things like that. So generally not good for discretionary purposes you don't need, but there could be some situations where a cash out refi is a good option for you. So a pretty common question when you do a refinance is how long of a mortgage you should take. And there are many different lengths. You can technically get a 20-year loan, you can get a 10-year, but the most common one everyone is familiar with is either a 15-year or a 30-year loan. And anything in financial planning is, there's always shades of gray. It's not a black and white, 15 is better than 30 or 30 is better than 15. It completely depends upon your situation and your goals of the refinance. If your goal is to increase cash flow, you may want to go with a 30. If your goal is to save money on interest and have your home paid off a little bit more quickly, a 15-year may make sense. So I've outlined a few different reasons to consider either a 15 or a 30-year loan. The 15-year loan, one of the benefits is you will get a lower interest rate. So over the life of your loan, you can save money on interest costs. So that's the biggest benefit of the 15. Have your home paid off sooner, always a benefit there. The negative with a 15-year loan, though, is that because you're shortening the term, you're going to be increasing your payment. Now, perhaps you already make extra payments on your mortgage, or you've already had a 15-year, or maybe you had a 30-year loan and you've paid it down, say 10 years, and so you're getting close to a 15-year. A 15-year could make sense in those situations. The negative with a 15, because you're fixing your payment high, it could also impact your cash flow. And so if your budget's pretty tight and there's not a lot of excess, locking into a 15-year mortgage might not make sense for you. You may want to consider some other options. And while it's really nice to have a home that's paid off and have no mortgage payments, one negative with home equity is it's pretty illiquid. You have to sell your home to unlock it or get a home equity loan, or there's something called a reverse mortgage. But once your home's paid off, that money is sunk into your home. You can't use it necessarily for unexpected expenses or to cover an emergency. So if you have a 15-year mortgage, generally you also want to have a pretty healthy emergency fund just because you won't have as much access to cash. A 30-year loan is a really interesting option if your goal is to lower your monthly payment. It is the most friendly if you need to also improve your cash flow. So if right now you took out a 30-year loan, say 10 years ago, and you go and get a new 30-year loan, your mortgage balance is smaller and your term is now extended out, again, 30 years, which means your payment's going to go down, which could improve cash flow. That could mean that you maybe could afford, maybe you need a new vehicle and you need to be able to make the loan payments on that. Maybe you need to pay down debt. Maybe you have other financial goals that you need to save for. And so the 30-year can give you that freedom and flexibility. And it's most cash flow friendly. The negative with the 30-year, however, is that you will have a higher interest rate. So if you compare the cost over 15 years of a 15 to a 30-year, you'll pay more on a 30-year loan due to that higher interest rate. One interesting strategy that I always like to consider for people, and again, it's going to depend upon your situation, is even if you have the cash flow to pay down the mortgage at a 15-year rate, if your budget may be a little tight and it's kind of close and you're waffling between, what you can do is you can get the 30-year loan and you can still make double payments and pay it down in 15. However, if something happens and money's tight one month and you need to back off the mortgage payment, now with a 30-year loan, you don't need to make that extra payment, so you get some freedom and flexibility, if that makes sense. So a 30-year loan can give you more cash flow options, but there's a cost to that with a higher interest rate. So where are interest rates right now? And this is as of today, so these are hot off the press. These rates are assuming a good credit score, and this is something that we help people out with through the financial coaching program at Wings for Widows. And there are some other factors, depends on the size of your loan and some things, but just to give you a general idea, a 30-year loan right now is around 2.625 with closing costs. A 15-year, you can see, is about 0.4% lower, 2.25% with costs. And to see a mortgage rate at 2% is just wild if you know the history of mortgages. Imagine lending money out to somebody for 30 years and only getting a couple percent on interest. So this is a heck of a bargain, especially when you look at historical mortgage rates. If you need to pull cash out, as we mentioned, potentially for refinancing some debt, consolidating your finances, it depends on how much cash you pull out will affect your rate differently. So if you pull out a small amount and still have 25% equity in your house, you add on only 0.125%. If you pull out a little bit more, up to 80% of your equity, you can add on 0.25%. And there's one note here that there are some credit unions that will let you pull out even more, potentially up to 90%. So if need be, there are some options. This cash out up to 80% though is for most institutions, and it'd be pretty common. If you don't want to pay any closing costs out of your pocket, and again, this would be for somebody who may be moving in the near future, you can utilize that no cost option and you add about 0.5%. So on a 30-year loan, you're just a tinch above 3%. So if your interest rate on your current house is about, I don't know, 3.375, 4%, you could do a no cost loan, pay nothing out of your pocket, and immediately lower your rate nearly 1%, which will definitely add money back to your pocket. One small note that I found, and I haven't seen this really well advertised, if you have a very small mortgage, as we said at the top of the call, an issue is you have fixed costs in a refinance, and those costs will be a large percentage of your loan, and it may affect this thing called break even. And so when you run the numbers behind the scenes, it might not make sense to refi a very, very small loan. However, there's one special loan that I found, and there may be other institutions that do this, but the one that I found is US Bank. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, shape, or form, but what I found is they have a special, they call it their Smart Refinance program. So if you have a very small mortgage, there's no costs on it. It's a 20-year term, and so it's a really good fit for that because of the way they structure it. You don't have any out-of-pocket costs. There's no fixed loan, and the issue is when it's really small. Again, bigger institutions are going to want a bigger loan because they make more money, so it's just harder to refinance a really small loan. So US Bank's Smart Refi program is a potential option for you. One thing that I've mentioned a couple different times, you may have heard me use this term break even. And the break even is a financial calculation that you do where you take into consideration your old rate, how much you have left on your mortgage, your new interest rate, how long of term you're doing, and the closing costs you're going to do. And you don't necessarily need to remember all of those things. But what I have on the screen is a little snippet of a break-even calculator that you can find. There's many of them out there. There are a lot of different ones. This particular one, which I found is pretty user-friendly, is from a cool website called NerdWallet, N-E-R-D, NerdWallet. And I think it's just kind of visually a little bit easier to understand than some of the calculators out there, but there's other good ones on many other websites. So I like to use the NerdWallet one myself. So what you do in NerdWallet is you plug in, they'll prompt you for, you know, your original mortgage balance, your term, and then potentially what your new mortgage will be and closing costs and things like that. And then it spits out this little calculation. And in this example right here, we can see that years 1 through 2 are red, which means in this specific example that I just threw together as a hypothetical, if you're going to be in your home for only 1 or 2 years, or maybe even 3 years, you would be money behind refinancing. So I assume some costs in here. And if you're going to live in your home years 3 up through 19, you come out money ahead and you save interest, but then you end up losing some money compared to your old loan in this example. And so this can be really useful if you're going to live in your home maybe for another 10 years. Refinancing could still make sense in this particular scenario. So some things to consider, you want to take a look at closing costs for the break even and the difference in term, meaning 15-year or 30, and what your interest rate difference is. And wrapping up, just to be respectful of everybody's time here, I just have a couple more, one slide and then our conclusion here, and that way everybody can get out on time tonight. So a few other, I'll call them insider tips for everybody on the call here today. So first thing is you can go to a bank, say US Bank, Wells Fargo, I'll just pick on those, the bigger institutions, or you can go to credit unions, or you can go to independent mortgage brokers. Oftentimes the banks, they will potentially keep the loan so you know the institution you're dealing with, but you may pay a premium because it's a brand name. Finding an independent mortgage broker can make sense because they can shop around and they may be a little bit more flexible on the closing costs and the rate. What happens then is they help you do the refi, and then they end up selling your loan to a financial institution that will service it. Pros and cons with either one. Usually, I like a broker because they tend to be able to get a little bit more competitive rates and costs, and you can negotiate a little bit more. But again, it depends on your specific situation. One thing you'll want to do is you definitely want to shop around because different institutions will charge different amounts to refinance your mortgage. There's a caveat though, because they will pull your credit score. And so your credit score will take a small dip, but if you shop it around within 45 days, rather than having multiple inquiries, which would lower your score, within 45 days, they just treat it as one. So it gives you the opportunity to maybe contact a couple different institutions, get some quotes, and then potentially pick the best one. As Leanne said though, and it was a wonderful tip, they are extremely busy right now. So it pretty much doesn't matter where you go. They may be a little bit slow to respond, or they may be just kind of backed up. I've gotten some emails from mortgage people at like 2 in the morning before when they're really backed up. So it's kind of feast or famine. When rates go down, they get extremely busy. And then when rates go up, they're a little bit less busy. So just as a little note there. One big thing that is very specific to the time we're in right now is if one of you in the home now, if this is say a family member and they're married, or if this is you yourself, if you have a job and your income's been impacted by COVID, you're going to have a very difficult time refinancing. Now, if you're retired, this doesn't impact you. You have retirement assets, potentially you have Social Security, maybe you have pensions. So you have some sources of income. And yes, you can still do a refi. If you're, say I just helped a 70-year-old person refinance to a 30-year loan because they needed to free up some cash flow. So it doesn't matter that you're retired, you can still refinance. One other thing is and this would be probably a little bit more for new home buyers. So if you know anybody in your family that were a little bit younger, where they maybe didn't have as much money down, they may be paying something called PMI. Refinancing now, if they have enough equity, might remove PMI. So that'd be something good to consider. And then one more thing, just one quick tip. When you do a refinance, they will quote you an interest rate. That interest rate will fluctuate every single day. And so you have the opportunity to do what's known as locked in. So when they quote it to you, they can say, for instance, Leanne, do you want to lock in your rate today? And what they're really asking is, do you think interest rates will go up, or do you think they'll go down? If they're going to go up, you should lock in. If they're going to go down, don't lock in. And this is a really tough thing to say right now at historically low interest rates. I say just generally lock in most circumstances, unless there's unless you have a really strong inkling that rates are going to go down. I think you're going to get a fantastic rate. And if the rates drop just a tinch and you miss out, oh well, that's okay. You're going to lock in. I think to give up potentially a higher, give up the low rate for a potentially higher one just doesn't make sense. So as a quick summary, and then I think we're running out of time here tonight, everybody. It's been wonderful to be with you. Rates are at historic lows. So if you have a mortgage yourself, or if you know somebody that does, it may be a good time to consider refinancing to save some money. Everyone's situation is different though. So doing a no cost or cash out, 15, 30, there's going to be a better combination for somebody than perhaps the next person. So you want to carefully evaluate what you're getting into, make sure you do some break-even calculations. And with that, everybody have a wonderful evening. That's everything I have for you today.
There is a question, Grant. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yep.
Okay. If there are co-owners on the mortgage, do all of them need to be involved, or can one person do the refinance?
Great question. All of the owners of the home, so however your home is titled, all of the owners of the home must be involved in some way, shape, or form. They will sign the note. However, you can run a refinance just off of one person. So let's just say there's two people. that own a home together. One person has really good credit and good assets, and another one does not have as many assets or poor credit. You can just do a refinance with one person, even though they may both own the home. So if one person has enough assets or income and a good credit score, it does not need to be done with everybody. The potential issue is if you have two people that own a home and only one person gets the mortgage, they then pass away, we may have some other issues with that other person in that home. So that might be a consideration to think about. Oh, Leanne, you're on mute here. No worries.
Sorry, I didn't want to echo. So, what is points when you have to pay points? And if you have to pay points, should you be shopping around for a better deal?
Yeah, it's in general, I will just say there's a huge bucket called closing costs. And when you do a mortgage, in that bucket of closing costs, it can be split out into points. There could be an appraisal that needs to be done. There could be some title insurance. So there's a whole bunch of small line items. And so points is usually the cost that that mortgage company is charging you. There may be other companies involved with that, and their costs will be broken out on a line item. And just because you pay points does not necessarily mean it's bad. There's many different ways to structure a refinance, but I would say you would absolutely want to shop that around because you may be able to find somebody that can do a little bit lower. Now, I will say one quick warning is you can play a lot of games with mortgages behind the scenes where you can, if someone's just focused on costs, they can lower the costs, but they can give you a higher rate. So you can say, I'm not paying anything out of pocket. My costs are so low, I'm not paying any points, but your rate is higher. That may not be better. And likewise, you can get a really low rate, but you could have really high costs. So you need to compare cost and rate. Those are the two pieces of the puzzle that when you shop around.
Does anyone else have a question?
Everybody survived a mortgage talk at 8 o'clock at night, so that you all deserve a standing ovation who's left on here. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, it's really, front burner on my mind, but I will mention that I am a U.S. Bank customer and I am refinancing through U.S. Bank, but it has taken since May. So I just want, and I email my representative about every other week saying, hey, I'm still out here, what's going on?
And to
So
Leanne's
just,
point, as long as you're locked in, it doesn't
yeah,
actually matter, which is kind of goofy. So, but if you get locked in and they promise you that rate, it could be annoying, but that process can be dragged out and you'll be just fine. But yeah, that is very, very true at most places.
Well, and that's why I was just saying it, because if you are considering doing it, it's not going to happen quickly from my experience anyway, and what Grant was saying. So your ducks don't have to all be in a row right at the beginning, because you're going to have to wait a while. Anyway, well, thank you. That was very, very helpful information. I thought tonight was just full of good information. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Grant. Thank you to all of you for attending. And I hope that we see you. Really important. I hope we all see you all at the benefit on October 8th. Have a great evening, and thanks again for attending.